My name is Camille Anderson, and I'm 28 years old. As I drove through the winding hills outside Asheville, North Carolina, the late autumn air hung heavy with fog, curling around my car like a memory refusing to fade. My palms were sweating against the leather steering wheel, something that hadn't happened since my first deployment. It had been 5 years since I last came home, and even then, it hadn't really felt like home. Not with how they treated me, not with how they looked at me like I was the one who threw everything away. Now, I was coming back with the silver eagle of a full colonel tucked inside my duffel bag, a symbol of a life they'd spent years dismissing, minimizing, and misunderstanding. What my parents and brother didn't know was that the very next day, at the prestigious annual event hosted by my father's company, everything was going to change. If you've ever been underestimated by your own family, looked at like you were less than, simply because you didn't follow the path they chose for you, stick with me. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and hit that like and subscribe button. Trust me, this story will show you exactly how powerful silent vindication can be. I pulled into the cracked driveway of the same craftsman-style house I'd grown up in, 2 stories, green shutters, a porch swing that still creaked when the wind blew just right. I sat there for a minute, letting the engine idle while my eyes traced the outline of the home I once loved and now barely recognized emotionally. With a deep breath, I shut off the car, grabbed my bag, and stepped out. The air smelled like pine needles and faint regret. As I climbed the porch steps, my boots echoed dully against the wood. Boots I had worn in war zones, in foreign bases, in briefings where one mistake could cost lives. Yet here, they somehow felt too heavy, too loud. When I opened the door, it hit me like a ghost. The same wallpaper, same framed photographs from a different lifetime, the same stiff silence that always settled between my mother and me, like fog off the mountains. Nothing had changed. Except me. "Camille, you made it," my mother's voice called from the kitchen. No footsteps to greet me at the door. No hug, no eye contact. Just the familiar tone of restrained obligation, like I was a guest, not a daughter. "Hi, Mom," I said, setting my bag down by the coat rack. Her silhouette moved behind the kitchen counter, still wearing that same faded apron with embroidered sunflowers. Her back to me, as always. "I just put the lasagna in. Your brother should be here any minute. He got another promotion, you know, senior operations manager now. Isn't that something?" I forced a smile. "That's great. I'll be sure to congratulate him." The pride in her voice when she talked about Caleb was always unmistakable. Warm, vibrant, the kind she never used with me. With me, it was always tempered, controlled, as if enthusiasm for my accomplishments had to be rationed. I wandered into the living room, fingers grazing the familiar surfaces. The mahogany coffee table I'd once scratched by accident in 6th grade. The mantel still displaying Caleb's high school football trophies. The family photo from his college graduation still front and center. Meanwhile, there was no sign of my commissioning ceremony, no newspaper article from the cyber threat task force I led, nothing to show I had ever done anything of value. Upstairs, my old bedroom was almost laughably preserved. The cheerleading ribbons from high school, the Duke University acceptance letter pinned proudly above the desk. They had frozen me in time at 18, the version of me they approved of, before I made the wrong turn and accepted the RODC scholarship instead of going into finance like they'd planned. They had always wanted me to follow in Dad's footsteps at Halcyon Systems, the defense tech firm where he had climbed the ranks for 30 years. They envisioned Caleb taking over one day and me working somewhere in operations or marketing, something respectable, something compliant. But I chose something else. I chose structure, discipline, purpose, and I was punished for it in every subtle, cutting way they knew. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, the comforter still the same shade of lavender, and exhaled slowly. I remembered the night I told them I was accepting the military scholarship. My father's disappointment had been so visceral, I almost rescinded my decision. Camille, the military is for people who don't have options, he had said. You're smarter than that. And maybe I was, but smart didn't mean obedient, and I had followed my own path anyway. Now, 5 promotions later, I wasn't just some soldier. I was Colonel Camille Anderson, appointed liaison for Project Sentinel, a $1.2 billion cyber defense initiative that Halcyon Systems was contracted to deliver. And the best part? No one in that house had a clue that tomorrow, when Shannon Delgado, the CEO of Halcyon, introduced me in that boardroom, everything they thought they knew about me would shatter. I walked over to the closet and quietly unzipped the garment bag. The deep navy blue of my formal uniform gleamed in the dim light. Rows of ribbons, medals, insignias. Every piece earned through deployments, strategy, sacrifice. I hung it carefully behind some old coats and closed the closet door. One more night of silence, one more family dinner of veiled disappointment. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow they'd finally see me, whether they were ready or not. The doorbell rang just as I was tucking the uniform back behind the closet doors. I paused at the top of the stairs, smoothing my expression into something neutral. Caleb had arrived, our family's favorite son, always on time, always praised. "Camille, Caleb and Julia are here," my mother called from downstairs, her voice a little lighter now, as if the energy in the house had shifted the moment he stepped through the door. I took one more breath and descended the stairs slowly, the weight of old memories pressing on my shoulders far heavier than any rucksack I'd ever worn overseas. The dining room was already bustling. My father stood at the head of the table, glancing at his phone between comments about client calls. My mother was setting the table with her best china, reserved for holidays and Caleb's visits. Caleb himself, tall and polished in a fitted blazer, flashed me a smile that felt practiced, like it had been worn too many times at too many conferences. Julia, his wife, wore a designer blouse and just the right amount of admiration on her face. "Hey, sis," Caleb said, stepping forward with arms wide. I let him hug me, though it felt more like a handshake in disguise. "Good to see you, Camille," Julia added with polite warmth. "You too," I replied, and I meant it, at least partially. We all sat around the long oak table, the same one we'd gathered at for birthdays, school celebrations, and Sunday dinners, except now I was just an awkward presence wedged into the background of Caleb's spotlight. "So," my father began, slicing into the conversation as he buttered a roll, "Caleb has some exciting news. Go on, son." Caleb smiled modestly, glancing around the table. "Well, I was promoted last week. I'm now overseeing the software systems division for Halcyon's Eastern operations. Shannon Delgado tapped me personally." "That's incredible," my mother beamed. "She doesn't just hand out promotions like candy. You must have really impressed her." "She said my insights on cross-platform integration could streamline the Sentinel rollout," Caleb said proudly. "It's a big deal. High visibility work." I sipped my water and kept my expression calm. It was more than ironic. He was now working on the very contract I had been overseeing for the Pentagon, but that truth would have to wait until tomorrow. "Camille," my mother said suddenly, turning to me with a tone just slightly above condescending, "how's your job going? Still traveling so much?" I set my fork down gently. "Yes, I'm working on a long-term project that keeps me busy." "Still the same position?" my father added vaguely, not even attempting to recall what rank I might hold. "Something like that," I answered, biting back the urge to correct him. The term colonel clearly hadn't crossed his mind. My mother didn't skip a beat. "Julia just got recognized by her firm, partner track by 35. Isn't that amazing?" "It's a huge honor," Julia added, though her cheeks colored slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the comparison. "And of course, Caleb's doing phenomenally," my mother continued. "It's just so nice to see young people building proper careers, stability, equity, not bouncing from base to base like, well, never mind, like me." That was the message behind the porcelain smile, the implication that I had somehow chosen chaos, drift, Rootlessness. I stabbed a piece of broccoli and forced a smile. Military postings aren't exactly optional. "Oh, I know," she said with a dismissive wave. "But it's not exactly a long-term plan, is it? I mean, eventually you'll settle into something permanent?" I opened my mouth to reply, but Caleb jumped in, laughing. "Come on, Mom. You know Camille's always been the wild card. Remember when she wanted to be an astronaut in 8th grade?" Laughter rippled around the table. I laughed too, but not for the same reason. They thought it was a joke. They always had. I looked across the table and caught Julia watching me, not with pity, but something quieter. Curiosity, maybe. Doubt. "So," I said smoothly, "what's the agenda for tomorrow's event?" "Oh, Shannon's coming," my father said quickly. "Very rare for her to visit a regional office. There'll be full briefings, tours of the R&D labs, and a formal update on the Sentinel contract. Some Army liaison is flying in too. High-ranking, I think." "Probably just a major," Caleb added with a smirk. "They'll be impressed, though. Big building, fancy conference room, state-of-the-art demos, the usual song and dance." My mother cut in again. "Well, let's just hope whoever they send is sharp enough to understand the technology. Military types can be a little procedural." I raised my glass slowly. "I'm sure they'll hold their own." Caleb chuckled. "No offense, sis, but you know how it is. Government folks don't always get the pace of the real world. Out here, it's about innovation, not protocols." I said nothing, just smiled, quietly. They would find out tomorrow exactly how much authority this government type held over their precious project. The rest of the dinner blurred into updates on Julia's boutique investment properties and Dad's hopes for retirement. Not one person asked where I'd been stationed last year or what my current assignment entailed. Not one asked what I wanted. By dessert, I felt like a ghost at my own family table, present, visible, but unacknowledged. Still, I endured. Because tomorrow, everything would change. Later that night, the house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of floorboards settling, familiar sounds that once soothed me, but now felt like echoes of a life I'd outgrown. I sat cross-legged on my old bedroom floor, surrounded by relics of who I used to be. High school trophies, dried-up cheerleading ribbons, and yearbook quotes about bright futures and endless potential. Except none of these mementos reflected the woman I had become. My fingers brushed across a yellowed newspaper clipping tucked into a bottom drawer, an old article about Caleb's promotion to junior analyst at Halcyon. It was carefully laminated. Next to it, in the same drawer, I found a crumpled envelope addressed to me in my own handwriting. Inside was the invitation to my officer commissioning ceremony, returned to sender. They never came, not because they couldn't, because they chose not to. I leaned back against the edge of the bed and let my head fall against the wall. The ache in my chest wasn't new, it was just sharper now, pressed up against everything I had built, everything I had earned. They never saw the late nights, the 18-hour shifts, the decisions that carried real weight, sometimes even lives. They never asked about my time embedded with Allied cyber units in Europe, or the week I spent locked in a classified command bunker, neutralizing a foreign breach in our infrastructure. All they saw was that I didn't sit behind a polished desk with a Halcyon badge like Caleb. But I remembered it all. The sleepless nights during my first deployment, decoding threat matrices in freezing concrete bunkers with nothing but caffeine and adrenaline holding us together. The moment I realized my instincts could detect anomalies faster than the system's own predictive models. That was the first time someone said, "You see things others don't." I hadn't known how much I needed to hear it. I remembered Captain Eleanor Grant then, my first commanding officer who became so much more than a mentor. She was sharp, unrelenting, and brilliant in ways no textbook could teach. She saw something in me that my family refused to acknowledge. "Use your mind like a weapon," she told me once after I flagged a data pattern everyone else missed. "You don't need to shout to be powerful." And I didn't. I never had. By 23, I was a captain. By 26, a major, after leading a task force that uncovered a coordinated cyber assault targeting our air defense protocols. The damage we prevented? Immeasurable. The recognition? Quiet. As always. Eleanor, now General Grant, was the one who recommended me for the liaison position at the Pentagon. "You speak both languages," she said, "military and tech. We need someone who can bridge the gap, someone who knows how to see the system from the inside out." And so I did. 3 months ago, when she placed the silver eagle of full colonel on my shoulder, I stood in a room filled with generals, engineers, and cybersecurity experts. Everyone who mattered in my professional world was there, except my family. I hadn't even told them. Not because I didn't want them there, but because after so many years of silence, dismissal, and indifference, I no longer needed their applause. I stopped waiting for their validation a long time ago. Still, there was a part of me, a small, quiet part, that wanted them to see. Not just the rank or the title, but the weight of what I carried, the responsibility, the intellect, the resilience, the sacrifice. I rose from the floor and crossed to the closet. My uniform hung perfectly, every thread in place. I unzipped the garment bag again, letting the midnight blue fabric breathe. Rows of service ribbons shimmered faintly under the soft lamplight. Beneath them, my insignia rested like a silent challenge to every assumption they'd ever made about me. Tomorrow, I wouldn't need to say a word. The room would do it for me. I ran my fingers along the inside hem, where my mother had once stitched my name into a school blazer. That name, Camille Anderson, had traveled far beyond these 4 walls. It had appeared on classified reports, on encrypted communications, on intelligence briefings sent directly to senior leadership. And now it would appear on Halcyon's guest list with full clearance, not as Caleb's sister, not as Albert Anderson's daughter, but as Colonel Camille Anderson, Pentagon liaison for Project Sentinel. I zipped the garment bag again and laid it gently over the chair. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, an encrypted message from the security lead coordinating tomorrow's event. I responded with a confirmation, then turned off the screen. Lying back on my bed, I stared up at the ceiling, where faded, glow-in-the-dark stars still clung to the plaster. At some point, I must have fallen asleep to the sound of the wind rustling through pine trees. But even in sleep, I carried the calm focus of someone who knew exactly what the morning would bring. Because tomorrow wouldn't just be another briefing or performance review. Tomorrow was the moment my family would finally meet the woman they never thought I could become. And I wasn't going to flinch. I woke up before the sun, the sky outside still wrapped in shades of indigo and steel gray. The house was silent, but my thoughts were anything but. I moved through my old bedroom like muscle memory, pulling open drawers, retrieving my neatly folded white undershirt, regulation slacks, and service shoes. Each item had its place, every motion practiced from years of early mornings and briefings in time zones that didn't care whether your body was ready. There was something meditative about the ritual, pinning each ribbon, tightening each brass button, adjusting the silver eagle insignia with slow, deliberate care. My movements weren't just about readiness, they were about respect. For the position, for the people I served with, and for the woman I had become despite everything. The uniform didn't make me someone new, it simply revealed who I'd been all along. As I twisted my hair into the prescribed low bun and secured it with a pin, I caught a glimpse of my reflection. The woman staring back at me was calm, poised, and unapologetically certain of her place in the world. There was no trace of the girl who used to sit at the same dresser, wondering why nothing she accomplished seemed to be enough for her family. This morning wasn't about confrontation. It wasn't revenge either. It was something deeper. It was clarity. I checked my watch, a gift from General Grant when I'd made colonel. The inscription inside simply read, "Earned, not given." The numbers glowed softly in the dim light. I still had 45 minutes before the first pre-meeting security check at Halcyon's headquarters. Downstairs, I heard the faint clink of a spoon against ceramic. Probably my father, already reviewing briefing slides over his black coffee. They had no idea I'd be attending. No idea that I was the one with final clearance on every decision they were about to present to the Pentagon. I waited until I heard the front door open and close, then his car pull away. A few minutes later, my mother's heels clicked down the hallway and out the door as well. Perfect timing. I descended the stairs in full uniform, my duffel slung over my shoulder, the weight of my rank steady against my collarbones. The house was bathed in early morning light now, soft, golden, almost nostalgic. Almost. At the door, I paused and looked back once, letting my eyes rest on the familiar living room, the overstuffed armchair my dad never let anyone else sit in, the coffee table with its stack of outdated business magazines, the framed picture of Caleb receiving his first Employee of the Month award. It all looked exactly as it had when I left 5 years ago, and yet everything had changed. The drive to Halcyon took 15 minutes, just enough time to shift from memory to mission. I mentally reviewed the morning's schedule. Building security sweep, restricted access check-in, classified protocol briefing with Halcyon's CTO, then the executive presentation with Shannon Delgado at 0900 sharp. Everything had been approved in advance, everything under my control. And yet, there was a quiet buzz in my chest, not nerves, but anticipation. This was more than a milestone, it was a reckoning. As I pulled into the lot, the glass facade of Halcyon Systems gleamed in the morning light, sleek, modern, sterile. A perfect symbol of power wrapped in polished neutrality. I drove past rows of employee cars and turned toward the reserved spaces near the executive entrance. My spot was marked with a temporary sign, Military Liaison, Colonel C. Anderson. I exhaled softly. Even seeing it in print felt surreal. At the security checkpoint, 2 guards straightened as I approached. One of them, young, barely out of high school, stared wide-eyed at my uniform. "Good morning, Colonel," the older guard said. "May I see your ID?" I handed it over without hesitation. "Colonel Camille Anderson, Pentagon Liaison for Project Sentinel." The younger one's eyebrows shot up slightly as he read the credentials. "You're clear, ma'am. The executive floor is expecting you." "Thank you," I said, offering a brief nod. "I know the way." Inside the building, the shift in energy was immediate. People paused mid-conversation. Eyes followed me as I walked past glass-walled offices and open-concept workstations. Some nodded politely. Others looked stunned. Military officers of my rank rarely visited regional offices, especially not ones tied to billion-dollar contracts, even less so when they looked like me. The elevator dinged on the executive floor. The moment the doors opened, I stepped into quiet, carpeted halls. Conference room 7A, top of the line, views of the mountains, climate-controlled lighting, full AV support. And just down the corridor, I saw him, Caleb. He was standing near a wall monitor, reviewing slides on a tablet, completely unaware of my approach. I walked quietly. Not out of secrecy, but out of discipline. I didn't need an entrance. My presence would speak for itself. When he finally looked up, his jaw slackened. His eyes scanned the uniform first, then the insignia. I watched it hit him, second by second. The title, the rank, the reality. "Camille, why are you wearing that?" I stopped in front of him, my tone even. "Good morning, Caleb. I'm here for the project review." Before he could respond, another voice joined us, one I recognized instantly. "Colonel Anderson?" My father. He turned the corner, flanked by 2 executives, laughter dying on his lips as he saw me. His face changed. Surprise, confusion, and something closer to panic flickered all at once. "Camille, what's going on? Why are you in uniform?" I offered him the same professional nod I'd given dozens of senior officials before him. "Good morning, sir. I was just heading to the conference room. The meeting begins in 20 minutes, correct?" The executives near him had already registered my rank and title. One woman from legal took a small step forward, extending her hand. "Colonel, it's an honor. We didn't know you'd be attending in person." I shook her hand, my gaze steady. I thought it was important to be here today. This project is too critical to leave to a screen. As I turned toward the conference room, I could feel the silence swell behind me. The shift had begun, and the truth was finally walking into the room. The conference room buzzed with quiet urgency as the support staff placed carafes of coffee, nameplates, and sleek digital tablets at every seat. Through the wall of windows behind the head table, the Blue Ridge Mountains stretched against the sky, serene and ancient, unmoved by the drama unfolding inside. I walked in calmly, the low murmur of conversation halting the moment my boots touched the polished floor. Heads turned. Chairs shifted. Some of the more junior team members blinked in disbelief, while others stole quick glances at my insignia, as if trying to confirm what their eyes refused to accept. One of the assistants moved to intercept me. "Colonel Anderson, we weren't told you'd be joining us in person today. Would you like a private setup?" "No need," I said evenly. "This seat will do just fine." I took the chair marked Military Liaison, Department of Defense, pulled out the provided tablet, and began reviewing briefing notes. The room slowly filled around me, but no one dared approach. I could feel it in the air, deference born not just of rank, but of presence. My father and Caleb entered together a few minutes later. Caleb's expression was tight, his usual confidence shaken, but not yet collapsed. He took a seat on the far side of the U-shaped table, pointedly avoiding my eyes. My father hesitated a moment longer before following him, sitting stiffly with his hands folded too precisely in front of him. I didn't look at them, not out of coldness, but because I wasn't there as their daughter or their sister. I was there as the Pentagon's voice. At exactly 0900, the door opened and Shannon Delgado, CEO of Halcyon Systems, entered. Impeccably dressed, poised, commanding, she moved through the room like someone who knew her value and expected the same from others. When her eyes met mine, she paused. A smile broke across her face. "Well, this is a surprise," she said warmly, heading straight toward me. "Colonel Anderson, I thought we were scheduled for a video conference." "I decided it was worth attending in person," I replied, standing to shake her hand. "There's a lot riding on Sentinel. I wanted to be sure we're aligned." Her grip was firm, respectful. "Excellent initiative. Your presence will elevate today's session." She turned to the group. "For those who may not know," she announced, "Colonel Camille Anderson is our Department of Defense liaison for Project Sentinel. She holds final authority on all military-side decisions, security, integration, technical compliance, and budgetary review." A few team leads murmured surprise. One executive's pen slipped mid-note. From the corner of my eye, I saw my father's posture falter slightly. Caleb's mouth opened just a fraction, then shut again. "Colonel," Shannon said with a nod, "please feel free to interject as needed." "Thank you," I replied, my voice steady. "I intend to." The meeting began. One by one, project leads stood and presented updates, supply chain delays, software revisions, encryption progress. Every major talking point eventually turned toward me, as if the room instinctively recalibrated itself. I asked direct questions, clarified specs, identified weak points in proposed integrations. Not to embarrass anyone, but because the project demanded it. This was national security, not a classroom experiment. And with each exchange, the truth grew louder. I wasn't here by accident. I wasn't some figurehead. I was the final checkpoint between their work and government approval. When it was Caleb's turn, I could hear the hesitation in his voice before he even stood. "As the team lead for user interface integration," he began, "I've developed a modular structure to streamline feedback from field testing into iterative design." His voice wavered as he glanced toward me, his usual rhythm fractured. I believe this approach will improve response latency by about 12%. "Can you explain how your proposed changes account for endpoint variability under active operations?" I asked, tone neutral but professional. Caleb blinked. "Sorry?" "Specifically, how does your structure manage asynchronous communication patterns during real-time threat escalation? We're deploying this in active zones, not test labs." He hesitated. I'd have to review that with my dev team. Please do, I said calmly. Send the revised analysis to my office by Friday. My father was still. Not angry. Yet. But rattled. He had just watched his son stumble, and his daughter take command of the room without raising her voice. The meeting moved on, but the atmosphere had changed. Eyes that once glanced over me now turned toward me with respect. Some even with admiration. By the time Shannon wrapped up the session, the power dynamic was irreversible. Colonel Anderson will remain on site through tomorrow to conduct additional reviews, she announced. Please provide her with full access and cooperation. This project's success depends on our alignment with the Department of Defense. As the room began to clear, Shannon approached me once more. You were brilliant, she said in a low voice. Everything General Grant said was spot on. We're lucky to have you. From the periphery, I saw my father take a half step forward, then pause, uncertain. Caleb stood a few feet behind him, no longer pretending not to look my way. The room was thinning out now, but the message had already landed. For the first time in my life, my family had seen me, really seen me. Not as an afterthought, not as a disappointment, but as the woman who now held their future in her hands. Later that evening, long after the boardroom had emptied and the corridors of Halcyon fell into a hush, I sat in a private conference space reviewing post-meeting documentation. The hum of fluorescent lights and the distant click of security doors had become oddly familiar in my line of work, sounds that accompanied decisions no one outside those walls would ever hear about. I knew I wouldn't be going back to the house that night, not because I couldn't, but because I needed distance. I booked a room nearby, overlooking the city skyline, and sent a short message to my mother. Staying closer to site. Early review tomorrow. We'll check in later. No need to explain. She likely hadn't noticed I was gone. Meanwhile, across town, in the dim light of his home office, Caleb Anderson sat hunched over his laptop. His hands hovered above the keyboard, unmoving. The glow from the screen reflected off his glasses, revealing a page half filled with security protocol charts he now realized had been approved by me. He couldn't stop replaying it. The room, the eyes shifting toward me, the CEO standing beside me like a colleague, not a guest, the way I spoke, the way people listened. He'd never seen anyone listen to me like that, not even our parents. With a quiet exhale, he closed the spreadsheet and opened a search tab. He typed slowly at first, Colonel Camille Anderson, Pentagon. The results loaded instantly. The first article was from Defense Wire. Youngest cybersecurity colonel appointed to lead Pentagon's Sentinel program. Below it, a photo, me in full dress uniform, standing beside General Eleanor Grant and a small team of high-ranking officers. I was smiling faintly, a glint of pride in my eyes. It wasn't for the camera. It was for the moment. Caleb stared at the image for a long time. Then he clicked on the article. The words hit like waves. Led the task force responsible for identifying and neutralizing a coordinated cyber intrusion into the U.S. defense infrastructure. Praised for her precision, discretion, and strategic foresight. General Grant called her one of the most gifted analysts in the history of the command. He sat back, stunned. He kept reading, clicking from one article to the next. A podcast episode where a retired general discussed the new wave of digital-era military leadership, referencing me by name. A panel at the Cybersecurity Innovation Summit where I had given the keynote address. A transcript of a Senate briefing where my report was cited as the backbone of the Army's new defensive architecture. None of it had ever come up at home. Not once. And now, he realized, that wasn't on me. That was on them. He opened another tab and typed my name again, this time pairing it with Halcyon Systems. An internal memo popped up in the employee database. Liaison contact. Colonel Camille Anderson, Department of Defense, clearance level A. She wasn't bluffing, he thought. She really does oversee everything we're doing." He sat there, absorbing it in silence. The weight of what he didn't know pressed down on him like humidity before a storm. Growing up, Camille had always been the one with the sharp eye, the one who read beyond the syllabus. She'd wired a homemade drone from spare radio parts at 14, designed her own encryption algorithm in college for fun. Caleb had chalked it up to hobbies, quirks, side projects she'd eventually trade in for something practical. But she hadn't. She'd just built her own world without asking for permission. His gaze drifted toward the corner of the room, where a framed certificate from Halcyon hung proudly on the wall. Employee of the Quarter, Caleb Anderson, just last year. He remembered how proud their parents had been. Champagne, cake, a Facebook post with 50 likes. No one had posted about Camille. No one had even asked where she'd been deployed last winter. And yet, here she was, sitting across from Shannon Delgado, holding the room, holding them all. He rubbed his forehead and leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like the most accomplished person in the room. And oddly, he didn't resent it. He just felt ashamed he hadn't seen it sooner. A knock came at his office door. Julia peeked in, holding 2 mugs. "You okay?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just catching up on a few things." She set a mug beside him and leaned against the doorway. "She was incredible today, you know." He looked up, surprised. "You were watching?" "Of course. Everyone was. She had total command. You could feel it." He offered a weak smile. "Yeah, I felt it too." Julia tilted her head. "She ever talk to you about what she does?" "No," he admitted. "But that wasn't her fault." He looked back at the glowing screen, at the photo of me in uniform, standing tall, calm, unshakable. Then, quietly, almost like a confession, he said, "I think I owe my sister more than a few conversations." Julia didn't reply. She didn't need to. She just placed a hand on his shoulder and left him with the silence he suddenly welcomed. Because for the first time, Caleb wasn't trying to outshine me. He was finally beginning to see me. The next morning, just before 11 a.m., I stood outside my father's office at Halcyon, staring at the frosted glass panel that bore his name, Albert Anderson, Director of Regional Operations. I could see their silhouettes through the partition, 3 shapes waiting on the other side. Someone must have called my mother to come in. Caleb was already there, perched stiffly by the window. I straightened my collar and knocked once. "Enter!" my father's voice called, but this time it lacked its usual command. I stepped inside. The room felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. My mother sat on the edge of a guest chair, hands clenched around her purse. Caleb stood with his arms crossed, not combative, just unsettled. My father rose behind his desk. "Please, have a seat." "Thank you, but I'll stand," I replied automatically, falling into parade rest without thinking, feet shoulder-width apart, hands clasped behind my back. Silence pressed down on us for a long moment. Finally, my father spoke again. "Why didn't you tell us, Camille?" I held his gaze. "Tell you what, exactly?" "That you were all of this, a colonel, a liaison, that you'd been overseeing the Sentinel project this whole time." "You never asked," I said evenly, and I stopped offering answers to questions no one cared to ask. My mother flinched slightly, her voice soft. "We didn't know. How could we know if you never—" "I did," I cut in gently. "I sent invitations to every promotion ceremony. I left voicemails when I was deployed. I even emailed you press clippings when parts of my work were declassified. You never responded." My father's jaw tensed. "But a colonel, that's a very high rank." "Yes," I said. "It is. Roughly equivalent to a VP in your corporate world." That landed. My mother sat back a little. Caleb's eyes dropped to the floor. "And now you're in charge of the entire contract," my father added, the words almost bitter. "So you came here to, what, rub it in our faces?" "I came home because it's been 5 years," I replied calmly. "Because you're my family, and despite everything, I wanted to reconnect. The timing with the project review was coincidental, though I'll admit, convenient." "Convenient," my father repeated, shaking his head. "You show up at my workplace in full uniform without warning. Do you have any idea how this looks?" I let out a short, dry laugh. "You're worried about perception? Dad, I've spent my entire career avoiding any appearance of nepotism just so I wouldn't be seen as your daughter climbing a ladder you built. General Grant assigned me to this project because of my performance record, because of merit." "General Grant?" my mother asked. "My mentor," I replied. "The woman who challenged me, promoted me, and believed in me when you didn't." My father's face reddened. "So this is about punishing us? Proving something?" "No," I said. "This is about doing my job. A job I've worked every day for the last 10 years to earn. The fact that you never took it seriously isn't my fault. It's not my burden." He rose from his chair, frustration tightening his features. "You let us believe you were still some junior officer pushing paperwork." "Would it have mattered?" I asked softly. "You dismissed every milestone. Every rank, every deployment. Last night at dinner, not one of you asked me a single real question about my work or my life. It was all about Caleb's promotion and Julia's investments." My mother shifted uncomfortably. "We always wanted what was best for you." "No," I corrected. "You wanted what you thought was best. You never once considered that I might know what I needed, that I might want a different kind of life." My father sat back down, shoulders sagging. "Your brother followed the plan. He's done well." "I'm happy for Caleb," I said honestly. "But that was never going to be my path." Caleb finally looked up. His voice was quieter than I expected. "All these years, we thought you were just stuck, that you'd stalled out." I nodded slowly. "I know. You made it pretty clear." He looked ashamed. "I didn't know what you were doing." "You never asked," I said, not cruelly, just honestly. My mother stood suddenly. "Well, now we know. And of course we're proud. Very proud." "Don't," I said gently, holding up a hand. "Please don't rewrite history. It cheapens whatever truth we could find now." She sat down again, deflated. My father cleared his throat. "Camille, what do you want from us? An apology? Public acknowledgement?" I shook my head. "Just respect. For my choices. For the life I've built. That's all I've ever wanted." The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. It was the kind of silence that holds truth. Then, slowly, my father stood again. He didn't reach for a hug. Instead, he extended his hand, formal, unsure, but sincere. "Colonel Anderson," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I failed to see your worth. I was wrong." I took his hand. "Thank you, Dad." "I still don't understand everything you do," he added, "but I'd like to learn. If you're willing." My throat tightened, but I nodded. "I'd like that too." My mother came next. She fumbled with her words. "We should have come to those ceremonies. I should have seen you." "I would have liked that," I said softly. Caleb remained by the window. Then he looked at me with something almost like awe. "So you outrank me by a lot, huh?" he said with a wry smile. "This was never a competition, Caleb." He nodded. "Maybe not for you, but it was for me. And I think I lost sight of what mattered." The honesty was unexpected, and more healing than anything else. There was still a long road ahead. Years of distance and misunderstanding couldn't be undone in a single morning, but for the first time, they weren't looking through me. They were looking at me, and maybe beginning to see. 6 months later, the air in D.C. had turned crisp. Autumn leaves littered the sidewalks in bursts of rust and gold, and the skyline glowed amber in the early evening light. I stood in my kitchen, barefoot, spooning caramelized onions into a cast-iron skillet, letting the aroma of rosemary and garlic fill the apartment. The windows were cracked open to let in the cool breeze, and soft jazz played in the background, just enough to fill the space without overwhelming it. For the first time in years, I was hosting my family for dinner. It wasn't a grand holiday or milestone. It was just time. Time to gather. Time to reconnect. Time to start again. Not from scratch, but from truth. My apartment overlooked the Potomac River. It wasn't huge, but it was home. A clean, modern 2-bedroom with polished wood floors, neutral walls, and just enough warmth to say, I've built a life here, and I'm proud of it. The doorbell rang at 6:01. I opened it to find my father standing there with a slightly awkward smile and a framed object under one arm. "Thought I'd bring this," he said. "Picked it up last week." I took it from him and turned it over. Inside the glass, a professionally mounted article from Defense Wire with my photo front and center. Colonel Anderson leads Sentinel to national recognition. "It was hanging in my office," he added, clearing his throat. "Figured you might want a copy." I ran my fingers along the edge of the frame, genuinely touched. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." He stepped inside, taking in the apartment with a nod. "Very you. Clean, organized, quiet. Military precision?" I teased. He actually laughed. My mother arrived shortly after, balancing a homemade apple pie in her hands. The scent hit me before she even said hello. "Still your favorite, right?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. "It is," I replied, helping her set it on the counter. "It always was." Her eyes scanned the space. "It's beautiful here, Camille. Peaceful." "Thank you." No comparisons, no veiled digs, just a simple, genuine compliment. That alone was progress. Caleb and Julia showed up last, carrying a fancy bottle of red wine and a small potted plant. "Because apparently you can't show up empty-handed to a colonel's house," Caleb joked. I smiled. "You brought the good stuff. I'm impressed." "Julia picked it," he admitted, nudging her gently. Dinner was casual but carefully prepared: roasted chicken with wild rice, sautéed vegetables, and a salad with figs and goat cheese. Nothing too extravagant, just enough to say I wanted this to feel special. We ate around the dining table I'd bought myself 2 years earlier, back when I thought I'd never host a family gathering again. Now, watching them pass dishes and compliment flavors, I allowed myself to breathe. Conversation flowed more easily than I expected. At one point, Caleb leaned back and said, "So, funny thing, I implemented one of your suggestions in our design framework last month. The team thinks I'm a genius." I raised an eyebrow. "Did you give credit where it was due?" He grinned sheepishly. "Eventually, after basking in the glory for about 5 minutes. Julia rolled her eyes with a smile. "He bragged to his boss about it." "I corrected it in the meeting," Caleb insisted. I chuckled. "I'm glad it worked. You've got a sharp team." Coming from me, that simple professional validation meant more to Caleb than any sibling compliment ever had. For the first time, we weren't rivals. We were peers. My father wandered toward the bookshelf, where a modest display of military awards sat beneath a photo of me and General Grant. He picked up a plaque and turned it over slowly. "I read that article about the breach you helped stop last year. I didn't understand most of the technical stuff, but it sounded serious." "It was," I said. "Had we not caught it early, a lot of critical infrastructure could have gone dark. Lives were at risk." He nodded thoughtfully. "I always assumed military work meant boots on the ground. Never thought about the cyber battlefield." "Most people don't," I replied. "That's why it works." The doorbell rang again, and I excused myself to answer it. Standing there in civilian clothes but unmistakable in presence was General Eleanor Grant. "Colonel Anderson?" she said with a warm smile. "Permission to join?" "Granted," I replied with a grin. "Glad you made it." She stepped inside, taking in the room with an approving nod. "Everyone," I said as we re-entered the living space, "this is Brigadier General Eleanor Grant, my commanding officer and mentor." My father stood immediately, extending his hand. "General, it's an honor." Eleanor took it firmly. "Likewise, Mr. Anderson. I've heard a great deal about you." He looked mildly surprised. "Good things, I hope." She smiled. "Your daughter speaks with clarity and restraint, but her work? It speaks volumes." My mother offered Eleanor a seat and a plate, bustling with a nervous energy I hadn't seen in years. Not performative, just unfamiliar. Like she didn't know how to host someone who had once carried her daughter through the crucible of command. As dinner resumed, Eleanor shared stories, carefully curated, unclassified vignettes that offered my family a glimpse into the world I lived in. She told them about my simulation software that became standard across all cyber training programs, about the field briefings I'd led in the middle of the night, about the people who called me first when something didn't look right in the system. "I didn't know," my mother said softly. "All this time, we didn't know." "You never asked," I said again, but this time, without bitterness, just truth. She reached for my hand, resting it gently atop mine. "But we're asking now. And for the first time in my adult life, that was enough." Later that night, long after the dishes had been cleared and the wine glasses rinsed, my parents sat chatting quietly with General Grant in the living room, their voices soft and curious. I stood in the kitchen, drawing a bowl when Caleb walked in carrying a few remaining dessert plates. "Need a hand?" he asked, already rolling up his sleeves. I passed him a towel. "I won't stop you." We moved in silence for a few minutes, the clink of ceramic and running water the only sounds between us. It was strange how quickly things had shifted, not because everything had been fixed, but because something fundamental had cracked open. The air between us wasn't heavy anymore, just honest. Caleb leaned against the counter and dried his hands. "I've been thinking a lot about that meeting." I glanced at him. "Which one?" He let out a soft laugh. "You know which one. The one where I realized my little sister could probably run circles around most of the execs on my floor." I smirked. "I wasn't trying to, but I'm not sorry either." "Don't be," he said, his voice quieter. "You earned that moment." He set the towel down and crossed his arms, not defensively this time, but like someone who had finally put down a burden. "I spent so many years trying to live up to what Mom and Dad expected," he admitted. "Trying to be their version of successful. The right job, the right title, the house, the wife, the investments, checking every box they handed me." "And you've done well," I said sincerely. "You're good at what you do." "Yeah," he nodded slowly. "But I always thought I was ahead of you, like I was the one doing it right." He paused. "That meeting? That day? It shook me." I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. "I looked you up," he said, offering a rueful smile. "After the meeting. Articles, interviews, podcasts, everything." I raised an eyebrow. "And?" "You're the real deal," he said, no hesitation. "Like, battlefield-level brilliance, strategic oversight, policy influence, all of it." His eyes met mine. "I couldn't do what you do, Camille. I mean that. I don't have your vision, or your patience." I rested my elbows on the counter, letting the vulnerability between us settle. "You don't have to do what I do," I said. "That's the point. You have your own lane, and I have mine. We were never meant to be the same." He nodded, then looked down at his hands. "I think I resented you for taking a different path because It exposed how limited my own perspective was. I was safe. You were bold. And instead of being curious, I judged you. I stayed quiet, letting the words breathe. When we were kids, he went on, you used to fix the remote when it broke. You were 8. I thought it was magic. But I never once told you I was proud of you. I swallowed hard. That wasn't your job. Maybe not, he said. But I wish I had. I wish I had been a better brother. That cracked something open inside me. Softly, not painfully. Just enough to let the warmth in. You still can be, I said, smiling gently. He nodded, then looked over toward the living room. I'm glad Mom and Dad finally see you now. It's overdue. I'm not sure they ever will in the way I once hoped, I admitted, but they're trying, and that's more than I expected. He gave a half smile. You always did have a higher threshold for disappointment than I did. I laughed. Military training. We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. Then Caleb's voice dropped to something softer, almost reverent. When I saw you in uniform that day, I didn't recognize you at first, but not because you looked different, because for the first time I saw you the way the world sees you, as someone powerful, respected, decisive. It made me wonder how many years I'd spent looking at you wrong. I took a slow breath. It wasn't all on you. I let it happen too. I let your version of success define mine for too long. Well, he said, pushing off the counter, maybe we both get to rewrite that now. Maybe, I agreed. He glanced toward the door. We should head out. Julia's already calling our ride. As we stepped back into the living room, my father was showing General Grant a family photo from 15 years ago. My mother was laughing at something Julia said about the pie. Caleb turned to me just before leaving. For what it's worth, he said, voice steady, I see you now. Really see you. I nodded. Thanks, Caleb. And as he stepped out into the hallway, I felt something in me shift. Not a dramatic ending, not a fairy tale resolution, but the quiet dignity of a bond being rebuilt. One honest word at a time. The apartment had gone still. The scent of rosemary and apple pie still lingered in the air, clinging to the corners of the space like memory. The table was cleared, the wine glasses rinsed, the laughter faded into a comfortable hush. Only 2 of us remained. I stood by the balcony, arms resting against the railing, watching the lights of Washington shimmer across the river. From here, everything looked peaceful, distant, controlled. The city pulsed quietly, unaware of the wars we fought behind walls and within ourselves. Behind me, General Eleanor Grant sat on the armrest of the couch, a half-empty glass of sparkling water in her hand. She'd already changed into something more relaxed, pressed slacks, a black cashmere sweater, but she still carried herself like a woman always ready to return to command at a moment's notice. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. She just watched me for a while, letting the silence stretch without breaking it. Finally, I turned toward her. I wasn't sure they'd show up. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. But they did. Yeah, I said, exhaling. They did. I walked over and took a seat across from her. They're trying, I added. I can feel it. Not perfectly, but for the first time, sincerely. Eleanor nodded, her voice calm and steady. That's all anyone can ask, especially from family. I tilted my head slightly. You ever go through anything like that? She smiled faintly. Let's just say I've eaten plenty of dinners where I was the only one at the table who knew what I'd given up to be there. That sat with me longer than I expected. Eleanor leaned forward, setting her glass down on the table. Camille, I've seen a lot of officers burn out chasing validation from people who'll never understand what we do. I don't want that for you. I'm not, I said honestly. At least, not anymore. She studied me for a beat. Good. I picked at a stray thread on my sleeve. I used to think if I just worked harder, climbed faster, made fewer mistakes, they'd eventually notice, eventually respect me. But now? I met her eyes. I think I've finally stopped needing their applause. Her gaze softened. That's not weakness. That's arrival. We sat in that truth for a moment, both of us knowing exactly what it had taken to get there. Do you ever regret it? I asked. This path? The rank? The sacrifices? Eleanor leaned back slightly, eyes distant. I regret moments. Birthdays missed, friends lost, silence from people I thought would be proud. She paused. But not the path. Never the path. I nodded slowly. I feel that too. She smiled. You're further along than you think. We shifted into quiet again, but it was a different quiet now. It wasn't avoidance. It was the kind that settles in after something hard has finally been named. Eventually, Eleanor broke the stillness. You've built something remarkable, Camille. Not just a resume, a legacy. You led a task force that changed how our military thinks about cyber warfare. You bridged worlds that weren't built to communicate, and you did it without ever compromising who you are. Hearing that from her meant more than I could say. I learned from the best, I said softly. She chuckled. Don't flatter me too much. I'm not done pushing you. Oh, I'm counting on it. Eleanor stood and stretched slightly. So, what's next? I took a breath, watching headlights trace down the street far below. I don't know yet. I've been thinking about staying in D.C. permanently, maybe joining the interagency task force full-time. General Patel mentioned they're forming a new division for emerging threats, quantum, AI, behavioral models. Sounds like your kind of chaos, she said. I grinned. You always did say I thrive in disorder. Only when it's necessary, she replied, and when it serves the mission. We moved back toward the kitchen. I packed her a few slices of pie in a foil container, laughing as she insisted I write her name on top like someone might steal it. At the door, she turned one last time. I meant what I said in the meeting, she told me. Your reputation is solid, but your character? That's what people remember. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. Thank you for seeing me before anyone else did. You were always visible, she replied gently. They just didn't know how to look. Then she was gone, stepping into the D.C. night with the ease of someone who had long since made peace with herself. I closed the door and stood in the quiet. The house no longer felt like a proving ground. It felt like mine. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of being enough. I was just me. And that was finally more than enough. A week later, I found myself alone on a quiet Sunday morning, sitting on my balcony with a mug of black coffee in hand, and the city still stretching itself awake below me. It was one of those still moments when the air feels heavy but calm, when the noise of ambition, expectation, and memory finally fades, just enough for you to hear your own thoughts clearly. The kind of morning I never used to allow myself. There was no urgent briefing, no flight to catch, no uniform to press or rank to carry like armor, just me, my breath, and the weight of everything I had lived through, finally feeling light enough to carry without strain. I had made it through the confrontation I never thought would come, the meeting not just with my family, but with my own younger self. The one who used to measure her worth by their approval, the one who stared at a closed bedroom door wondering what more she had to do to be seen. I see her now. I sit with her. And I thank her for not giving up. My father called yesterday to tell me he'd submitted my name to the Halcyon internal newsletter under Pride in Partnership. His tone was hesitant but proud. My mother sent a photo of that framed article now hanging in their hallway, right next to Caleb's degree. It still surprises me sometimes, how people change when you give them the space to catch up. And Caleb? He's different now, too. We don't talk every day, but when we do, it's honest, curious, no longer guarded by competition. We're learning how to be siblings again, without rivalry as the foundation. But more than what they see in me, What matters most is what I see in myself. I see the woman who stayed up for 40 hours straight in a field lab, piecing together a breach that would have cost lives. I see the officer who gave everything she had to prove that strategy, empathy, and courage could coexist. I see someone who stood alone for a long time, and stood anyway. And to anyone listening who's ever felt like the disappointment in the room, the black sheep, the too much, the not enough, the one who didn't fit their mold, let me tell you something clearly. You are not the failure of their expectations. You are the triumph of your own resilience. No one saw me for years. But I didn't stop building. And eventually, quietly, without vengeance, I became undeniable. It's never been about proving them wrong. It's about proving to yourself that you were right to believe in the version of you they couldn't imagine. The one who wanted more. The one who trusted a different path. The one who never settled for smallness, even when it meant being misunderstood. I look around this home, my space, my peace, my proof, and I realize that legacy isn't built through applause. It's built in the quiet choices, the early mornings, the boundaries drawn, and the dreams defended behind closed doors. And now, I live not for recognition, but in alignment with who I am, with what I know I can do, and with the certainty that respect means the most when it's earned, not begged for. So if this story found you in a place where you're still fighting to be seen, by family, by colleagues, by people who only know how to recognize their version of success, keep going. Don't shrink to fit the frame they built for you. Build your own damn wall. Hang your own name on it. And when they finally show up, let them see who you've become. Not for their validation, but so they'll know they never had the power to define you. If this story spoke to you, if you've ever felt invisible or underestimated, or like your worth depended on who clapped the loudest, drop a comment, tell me where you're listening from, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you believe your path is valid, even when others can't see it yet. Thank you for letting me share mine. My name is Colonel Camille Anderson. I was underestimated. I was dismissed. But I never disappeared, and now I'm exactly where I'm meant to be.